So I think so. One of the things that our ministry family here in Nepal has been looking at, that has been like really heavy upon our heart, has been this idea that we are supposed to be set apart for the Lord, consecrated and set apart for the Lord. And so that's a little bit of kind of like we have part of the thing that's happened to us is that we have all these kids in our children's home, right? And they've started to grow up. And so now we have kids that are like, they used to be really cute little kids, right? And like you just played with them, they're cute little kids stuff. And now they're teenagers, which I'm 35 and I'm a parent to like 10 teenagers and some college students who are like, between, I got like 16-year-olds to like 22-year-olds that I'm like a parent to, like I'm like their dad. And it is crazy. It is a crazy world trying to, parent teenagers and parent young adults. And praying, and our leadership has been praying, actually, how do we love these kids that the Lord's given us? How do we disciple these kids that the Lord's given us? How do I parent these kids that the Lord's given us? The theme that's come back over and over and over again is the Lord has been calling us, like, teach them to be set apart. Teach them to be different and be okay with being different. We live in a world right now where I think one of the biggest idols is needing to fit in or needing to have influence, and needing to be liked, needing to be, giving into the praises of the world and praises of friend and praises of men, needing to be adored by them. And so this theme has been coming into our ministry where we've been constantly trying to push our people and push our youth to say, hey, let's live set apart. Let's live different. Let's live consecrated unto the Lord. What does that look like? And so I kind of want to look at that a little bit today in a slightly interesting way. And so if you have your Bibles, go to Revelations 19. Now, Revelation 19, I think I probably talked about this last time with you guys. Revelation 19 is one of my favorite passages in all of the Bible, in the entire Bible. But I'm going to look at one very small thing here in Revelations 19, verse 6 and 7. 6, 7, and 8. And so in Revelations 19, verse 6, 7, and 8, what we have is the end of the story and the end of the age. This is what's coming in the day to come. This is what's coming when Jesus comes again. And when Jesus comes again, it says there's going to be a great roar, like a voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, like the sound of mighty peals of thunder. And all of creation is going to cry out, and it's going to say, hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. Now, I want you to remember that phrase right there, the phrase that it was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous seed of the saints. So we have this picture of the bride of Christ, the church, at the return of Jesus, right, having made herself ready by clothing herself with this fine linen, which is active righteous deeds, active works of righteousness. Now, keep that in mind, because if we go back one chapter to Revelations 18, I don't have time to go over all of it, but Revelations 18, we have this narrative about the fall of Babylon. Now, what's really interesting, right, is in Revelations 18, verses 2 to 3, it tells us, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passions of her sexual immorality, and the kings of earth have committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. In verses 9 and 10, it tells us that, the kings who committed sexual immorality, they were living in luxury, and now they all weep, alas, alas, you great city, mighty Babylon, for a single hour of your judgment has come. And if we go down to verse 15 and 16, this is where I want to focus. It says, the merchant of these wares who gain wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth had been laid to waste. And so what's really interesting here is you have two cities, two women really, that were presented. We're presented with Bride of Christ in Revelation 19, and we're presented with this woman called Babylon in Revelations 18. And both of them are dressed in fine linen, right? Revelations 19, you have the Bride of Christ that's dressed in the fine linen, which represents her righteous deeds, righteous good works. In Revelations 18, we have Babylon dressed in this fine linen, which is representative of wealth, of riches, of the culture of the world, of influence, of money, of pleasurable things from the world, and all this stuff like that. And what's interesting is we get this passage here in Revelations 18, verse 4, where the voice from heaven that's going to talk in Revelations 19, it says, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heavens, and God has remembered her iniquities." And so we have this interesting contrast here in the end of the story, where you have the Bride of Christ and you have Babylon, and they're both wearing this fine linen. And John, who's seeing this vision, is basically given this choice. Are you going to become like Babylon, or are you going to become like the Bride of Christ? Are you going to dress yourself in the fine linen of righteous deeds, or are you going to dress yourself in the pleasures of the world, in the seductive economy of the world, in the ways of the world, in the things of the world, in the pursuits of the world, right? And so we have this drastic contrast where basically what we're told at the end of the story is that at the end of the age, the people who are prepared as the Bride of Christ are going to be marked as specifically different. They're going to visibly look different. They're going to be wearing a different kind of fine linen, a different kind of clothes than what the world is going to be wearing. They're going to look 100% different from the world. And that's really important because this is not just a concern that we see in Revelation. If you go with me to 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to look at something here in 2 Timothy chapter 3. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we have this really interesting thing that happens. Now, 2 Timothy is really important because it's the last letter that Paul writes. You know, Paul's about to die. He knows it. He's writing to Timothy, his son, to tell him, I'm about to die. These are like my last words. These are my last things that you should be aware of before I pass away. And in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 to 5, we get this really long list of pretty bad things. So I'll just read it. It says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulties. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of self, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people." And so we have this long list of horrible stuff that's going to begin to be cultivated at the last days, you know? So we're going to have people who are going to love themselves. People who are going to become selfish. They're going to be motivated by selfish desires. We got people who are going to become lovers of money. They're going to be motivated primarily by money. We have people who are going to become proud. People who are going to become arrogant. We're going to see an increase of abusive behavior. We're going to see an increase of rebelliousness against parents. We're going to see an increase in ungratefulness. We're going to see an increase in unholy behavior, and so on and so on and so on. An increase of slanders, so an increase of lies, an increase of false things being, perpetrated as and promulgated as truth. We have people who are no longer going to love good, people who are going to love evil, who are going to justify evil behavior. And so we look at this whole long list, and the scariest part about this list, though, is that this list isn't talking about the world. If you look at this list really carefully, look at verse 5. Paul is talking to people who have the appearance of godliness but denying its power. In other words, Paul is talking about the church, right? If you look at verse 4, it says, people are going to be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That tells us that this is not directed at the world. It's directed at the church. Paul is writing to Timothy to warn Timothy that this behavior is going to begin to be cultivated inside the church. That at the end of the age, what we're going to see is that people in the church are going to start to be tempted into these things. They're going to be tempted at the last days into being lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, etc., etc., etc. Now that's really significant for us to think about, because if we go down to same chapter, if we go down to chapter 4, right? Chapter 4, verse 3 to 5, again talking to the church. It says that for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itchy ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. Again, talking about the church, saying that at the end of the age, what we're going to see, in the last days, what we're going to see is that even in the church, right, the temptation is going to be, man, the church is going to be focused on us. It's going to be focused on self. We're going to start cultivating this self-centered Christianity within the church that is going to lead to ruin, because we're going to start hearing the voices of the world, hearing the things of the world. We're going to start listening to our own truths. We're going to listen to things that make us happy, listen to things in our ears that make us happy, that please us. And as a result, we're going to actually start wandering off into myths, wandering off into things that don't actually lead us to that fine linen, which is the righteous deeds of the saints. We're going to live a Christianity that actually promotes us to just live comfortable lifestyles that serve ourselves, rather than live cross-driven lifestyles where we're picking up our cross, laying down our lives, setting aside our own desires, and following Him. And Paul is so concerned about this, that this is his last message to Timothy. Like, Timothy, be warned. Be warned. This is coming to the church. It's not just, the world is going to seep into the church, and be careful. Be careful that you don't fall into the ways of the world, but be careful that you don't fall into the selfish pursuit of things in the world. And we see in verse 10 of chapter 4, it says, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. And so already, right, in Paul's time, we already see this man named Demas, who's already drifting in that way. He's part of the church. Paul doesn't say he's not saved. He's part of the church. But he's now no longer useful for ministry. He's drifted back into this self-centered focus. And while he is saved, while he's still Christian, he's drifted into this self-centered Christianity. Now, that might sound really heavy. That might sound like, whoa, what's happening here? Like, what is he talking about? But I want to go even further back. Let's go all the way back to the Old Testament. Let's go back to Leviticus, because God has been warning his people about this idea of needing to be separate from the world since the beginning. And so if we go to Leviticus chapter 20. Remember, your Bobby, with Leviticus chapter 20. In Leviticus chapter 20, we see this really interesting thing, right? Leviticus chapter 20, verse 22 to 26. This is what it's going to tell us. It says, you shall therefore keep all my statutes in all my land and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the customs of the nations that I am driving out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the people. You shall therefore separate the clean beast from the unclean, and the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not make yourself detestable by beast or by bird or by anything with which the ground crawls, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy. and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. Let's take a look at this. What does this tell us? This tells us that the reason why the people of Israel were given all those rules, right? Let's be honest. Most people, when they read the Bible, Genesis is okay, right? Exodus is okay. And then you get to the wall that is Leviticus, because you're like, oh my gosh, all these laws and rules and stuff like that. How am I going to read through this? This is like, and we skip them. And we're just like, okay, great. The Jews had a bunch of these laws. And then we go to the New Testament, we skip to Matthew, and we're like, yeah, we don't need to follow those laws anymore because we're in the new covenant, right? And we miss, like, why is there that huge chunk of scripture are these laws? Why are there so many rules in the Old Testament? And it tells us right here why. It tells us that the reason why Israel was given all of these rules was for one reason, was so that they could be separated, set apart from the peoples, and so that they could be the Lord's. It was about relationship. It was about the Lord saying, I am giving you these things so that you will be dramatically different from the other nations around you, and so that they will know, and you will know that you belong to me. Now, what's really interesting about that, right, is if we think about that in the context of the New Testament, it's the same thing. When Jesus is telling you, love your neighbor, when Jesus is telling you, go and love the poor, when Jesus gives us the Matthew 25 thing, like, clothe the naked, feed the sick, etc., stuff like that, is when Jesus talks about, like, the greatest act of love is this, that he who lays down his life for his friend, right? Or when Jesus talks about, like, even a non-believer would forgive somebody who, if they owe them something. But it's when you go and choose to love your enemies and forgive your enemies. Not even non-believers wouldn't do that. That's crazy. The New Testament calls us to live in a way that's dramatically different from how the world lives. It's always been about that. Even in the Old Testament, we see that. The reason why God gave them all these rules is so that they would be dramatically different. So they would look dramatically different. Now, here's the really interesting part. Here's the really cool part I want you to think about, okay? Look at verse 24. This is, but I said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples. So, what do we got here, right? We got, they're going to go into the promised land, right? That land that they're going to possess is a land flowing with milk and honey. But what? There's a condition here that people don't pick up. It says, I've separated you from the people of the land that I'm going to kick out. And then the land's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey. Everyone following me? Now look at this, okay? Look at 22. You shall therefore keep my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. Is everyone following? That's a really strange contrast there, right? It says they're going to go into the promised land, and as they're in the promised land, what do? They're going to inherit that land, but they must not behave, they must not live according to the culture of the nations that the Lord has driven out before them, right? So if they enter into the promised land and they behave as a nation that is set apart, that is different from the culture in the promised land, then the land that they're going to possess is going to be a land of milk and honey. But if they go into this promised land and they behave like the culture of the people in the promised land, like the culture of the world, of the idolatrous people in the promised land, what's going to happen? The Lord says the land is going to vomit you out. In other words, they can physically be in the promised land. They can literally physically be in the promised land, but not access the land flowing with milk and honey. They can be in the promised land physically, but not actually access any of the promises. In fact, a land that should be flowing with milk and honey becomes a land that's going to vomit them out, that's going to revolt against them. And what's interesting is that we actually see that happen to Israel, right? We see that happen to Israel. Israel, all throughout the rest of the New Testament, or Old Testament, what happens? They're in the promised land. They're in the promised land. And yet, because they constantly give into the idols of the foreign nations and begin worshiping them, because they constantly give into the culture of the foreign nations that are living there, what happens? they never actually access the fullness of the promises that the Lord has for them in the promised land, right? They live in the promised land, but they don't live actually in any of the promises that God promised that he would give to them. And so we see this. We see this also, last little bit that I want to look at here is we see this especially in one of my favorite stories that talks about this in Judges. In Judges 13, very famous story about Samson. You guys should all know this story, I think. But Judges 13, we have the story of Samson. Again, I want you to look at just the first verse here in Judges 13 to start. Judges 13, verse 1. It says, "And the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Look at that. Remember, where's Israel? Remember, Israel is in the promised land. The people of Israel are physically in the promised land. And yet what happens? Because they choose to behave like the culture of the Philistines, who used to own the promised land, because they behave like the culture, God says what? Okay, I'll let you be enslaved by the culture. Because they choose to behave like the culture of the world, the Lord says, you can be enslaved to the Philistines for 40 years. So instead of Israel, by being set apart and influencing, being a force to reshape the promised land into a place flowing with milk and honey and blessing and prosperity for the people of God and for the nations surrounding, because they conform to the culture of the nations around them, what happens? They end up becoming enslaved to the culture around them. And so we come to Samson. Samson's super interesting. If we follow Samson, what does it say? Verse 4. It says, "Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So we have this introduction of Samson. And what does it tell us Samson's going to be? Samson is going to be someone who is set apart for the Lord. He is somebody who is different, visibly different. I mean, he's going to be a hairy dude because he's not going to shave, right? I don't have time to go over the whole Nazarite vow with you guys, but he's going to be fully set apart from the womb, from the beginning. He's going to be set apart for the Lord. And what happens? Because he is going to be set apart for God, because he is different from everybody else around him, what's going to happen? He's going to be able to begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. In other words, he's going to actually be able to save the people. God's going to be able to use him to save people because he's different, because he chooses to be different. Now we come to Judges 16, the famous story of Samson and Delilah. And we look at this. I want you to, Judges 16. I want you to look at this thing and pay attention to one thing. So we know the story. It's kind of silly, you know. Delilah goes, "Samson, tell me how you can lose all your power." And Samson, for some reason, tells her 3 different lies and doesn't break up with her. I'm like, bro, this girl literally told you to do something and then called the Philistines to come and beat you. And I'm like, what? Like, why would you break up with her the first time? But anyway, look, I want you to notice what she says. Let's look at, Let's look at how Samson responds. Verse 7. Samson says to her, "If you bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Look at verse 11. "If they bind me with new robes that they have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Right? Look at verse 13. "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Right? Verse 17. "A razor has come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." It's that phrase right there, right? I will become like any other man. How does Samson lose his power? You know, we got taught this in Sunday school. Samson lost his power because he cut his hair. It's not just because he cut his hair. Samson lost his power because when his hair was cut, what happened? He lost himself being set apart. He lost himself being different from the culture of the world, right? He became like any other man. And as he became like any other man, as he became like the rest of the people, as he became like the culture, he lost all his power. He lost his ability to do what he was meant to do, which is to save Israel. Now, what's interesting is obviously you know the rest of the story. It says in 22 his hair begins to grow back. It tells us at the very end, 28, Samson cries out to the Lord and says, Lord, remember me. Remember me. Let me do what I was called to do. Let me avenge my eyes on the Philistines. Let me do what I was called to do. Pushes down the tower, kills all the Philistines. And by the grace of God, ends up still completing what he was supposed to do, which was to start the deliverance of the Israel people from the Philistine people. But the key I want to highlight there is that Samson's strength, Samson's ability to save the Israelites people was rooted in him being different. It was rooted in him being set apart and consecrated to the Lord. It was rooted in him being dramatically different, visibly different from all the people around him, from the culture around him. And so, to bring kind of like this sermon to a close, right? This has been a theme in our ministry here. How do we live as people set apart for God? How do we live as people who are different from the culture around us? How do we think differently than the world thinks? How do we have different priorities than the world has priorities? How do we behave differently than the world behaves? How do we talk differently than the world talks? How do we think differently than the world thinks? How do we spend our money differently than the world would spend its money? How do we do our life? How do we live our life so that it doesn't look like the world at all, but it looks and is driven completely by Jesus? Because, like Samson, I think we're similar. We've been given this commission by the Lord to go out, save the lost. Go out, make disciples of all people. Go out and save people. But here's the situation, right? How are we going to do that if we look like them? If we look exactly like them? How are we going to give the world something better if all we have is what they have already? And so, what I've been trying to tell our young people even here, is, hey, it's good to be different. Our strength comes from being different. Our ability to actually lead people to Jesus comes from us living differently and acting differently and behaving differently. It comes from making different choices of how we're going to think, how we're going to spend our time, how we're going to spend our money, how we're going to respond to people, how we're going to respond to the poor, how we're going to respond to persecution, how we're going to respond to people making fun of us. It comes from us having different priorities and asking yourself, hey, why do I do what I do? Why do I choose what I choose? Why do I live the way I live? Why do I dress the way I dress? So much of the church right now, I believe, looks just like the world. And I think because the church looks just like the world, that's a little bit of the reason why the church doesn't have very much power anymore to change the world. And so I guess my challenge for you guys today is very simple. How can you live differently? How can you live set apart? How can you live with priorities that are Christ-centered and Christ-like rather than driven by worldly concerns or driven by pressure from the world? How do we, for example, just to challenge some of you guys, I'm sure you guys have money, right? How do you live in a way where the way you spend your money is driven by the Lord, is driven by God's desires? How do we live in a way where the decisions that we make regarding our future, what am I going to do in my life? What sort of jobs am I going to take? Where am I going to go eat? How can we just choose to make those decisions in a way that's dramatically different from how the world would do it, and rather rooted in an intimate fellowship and relationship with Jesus Christ? I think about Paul, and how Paul was this man who lived so different from the world. I want you to just think about Paul for a second if you know the story of Paul. Paul started out as what? He was the Pharisee of Pharisees. This dude was like on a good career path, man. He was like a Pharisee. He was a leader of Pharisees. He was this young guy who was like up and coming. Everyone loved him, right? He was a wealthy Pharisee. He was a Roman citizen. So he had money, was wealthy, was super comfortable. This guy had influence, because think about it. This guy literally was able to tell a bunch of people, let's stone Stephen. And they were all like, yeah, let's do it. I mean, like, what kind of level of influence do you have to have where you can be like, let's kill a guy, and everyone's like, yeah, let's do it, right? So you got this guy who's popular, he's got influence, everyone loves him, he's up and coming with the Pharisees, he's got a great education, he's got money, he's got wealth, he's got a family name, he's got a good citizenship, all of that, right? And then what happens? One encounter with Jesus. One encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. It's all gone. You ever think about that? Paul traded all of that. He traded all of that to do what? To become this poor, itinerant missionary who gets beaten, shipwrecked, persecuted, almost killed a few times, right? Has to travel around with no place to lay his head, right? Has no home, has no position, has no reputation anymore. The Pharisees hate him and want to kill him. He's got to make tents for a living. Gives up everything. Why? Because he caught a glimpse of the reality that, hey, this is what's going to save people. Jesus is the only thing that can save people. I'm going to live a life that's different for him so that people can come to know Jesus, so that people can come to know who he is, so that people can be saved. Jesus, and I think that's why most of the New Testament we have is written by Paul. It's because he was this radical, on-fire guy who gave up everything, who chose to live totally against the norm and expectation of everybody else around him, and live for one purpose, which is Jesus. I want to satisfy the desires of your heart. I want to see you have a bride. I want to see people get saved. And so the challenge I have for you guys today is, would you choose to live differently? Would you choose to take the time to think, evaluate your own life, evaluate your own choices? How can I make choices that better honor and better reflect Christ's desires, rather than still choices that are for me? Remember, Paul said at the end of the age, this is going to be the big battle right now. People in the church even are going to become lovers of self, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, lovers of etc., etc., etc. So the choice is, will we be a people that instead of going down that route, we'll be a people who pick up our cross, deny ourselves, and follow the Lord, and live countercultural to the ways of the world? Amen?
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, if anybody has any questions, questions.
Brother,
If there's-
you want
there
to
is-
finish your question, or your question got answered?
The last time you say about the Bible school, is that the people come all free for
Yes.
Bible? And
Yes,
then,
the Bible is completely free.
And then
So-
since you
So that
24/7 the church in
I
your
think
facility,
that is an example of us doing something that makes no sense, and is countercultural. So the reason why we started that was because in Nepal now there are a lot of seminaries and there are a lot of Bible trainings. The problem is people run them as businesses here. So they run seminaries as business here, they run Bible trainings as businesses here, and they become prohibitively expensive for the lower caste Nepalese. And so the problem right now in Nepal is you have Bible trainings that are available, but nobody can afford to go to them. And so what's the point of that? And so And I understand that, because a lot of the Bible schools and trainings that run here, what they say is like, well, why not? Because we can make money off of this. These Nepali students who want to come, they can pay us to run a Bible training, and we'll make money off of this, and then I can live comfortably just teaching the Bible. Or they'll say stuff like, we can use this to raise money from the West, and you have to go find a Western sponsor to pay us, and then I can have money to make money. We are, at the moment, the only training that we know of in Kathmandu that is entirely free. So we sponsor it. We fully pay for every single thing for our students, because our goal is to give people who would never have an opportunity to get training, to get biblical training, to be able to get the biblical training so they can pastor their church as well. Right now, the biggest problem in Nepal is that there's so many believers and a very low number of pastors that have gotten biblically trained to be able to teach them. And so we were like, we'll meet that need. We won't try to make money off of this. We're just gonna do this for free. And it's a joy to do it for free. And we've gotten amazing opportunities to teach students that otherwise would never have been able to get biblical training. And that's opened the doors for us to work with tribes of people that are extremely remote, that are extremely poor, that desperately need Bibles and desperately need the gospel, that we would not be able to have built a relationship with if we charged for our school. And so again, one of the examples of doing something that's different, doing something that's against the culture, doing something that's even against the Christian culture here, which is to try to make money off of every little thing that you do here. But the result of that being, and people always tell us, they're like, oh, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable if you do it for free. And I'm like, I'm not going to worry about sustainability. I'll let God worry about sustainability. I'm going to focus on doing what the Lord told us to do, which is to give a training away for free, and to, even if it doesn't make any sense. But the result is, like I said, last year we got the opportunity to train, to give biblical training to the first 2 leaders in the entire Chepang tribe to ever get pastoral training. I mean, you're talking about a tribe in a mountain where there's now slowly thousands of believers who need a pastor, and we got the opportunity to train the first 2 pastors who got actual Bible training. All the other pastors that are currently leading their churches are illiterate and have never gotten Bible training. And they sent us 2 young guys who are now the first 2 ever biblically trained leaders in that entire tribe. We have an outreach planned in about a month where they're calling 800 people, half of whom are believers, half of whom are not believers, to come and hear the gospel and get biblical teaching. That opportunity never would have happened if we didn't offer the training for free, because their tribe is so poor that they can't afford it. So, yeah, there you go.
Great. Any other people? Question? Before you take all the time.